courage alone did not build the Roman Empire. Rome built its empire on debt. We picture the Roman legions as unstoppable warriors, driven by honor, discipline, and bravery. But behind every polished helmet and every sharpened gladius was something far more powerful and dangerous: money. Thousands of soldiers required food, weapons, armor, and pay. Horses needed feed. Roads had to be built. Siege machines demanded timber, engineers, and labor. None of it was free. Every Roman victory came with a price tag, and over time that price reshaped the entire empire. To understand how Rome conquered the ancient world, you first have to understand how it paid for war. And once you do, the story begins to feel uncomfortably familiar. Welcome to Economic Story. In the early days of the Roman Republic, war was cheap. The army was not professional, it was a citizen militia. If you owned land, you served. Soldiers provided their own weapons and armor. Campaigns were short, local, and seasonal. Men fought, then went home to farm their land. The state didn't require massive budgets, long supply chains, or permanent military salaries. This system worked because Rome was small. But as Rome expanded beyond Italy, everything changed. Wars moved farther from home. Campaigns lasted years instead of months. A farmer could not leave his land for 5 or 10 years and expect to survive. The old system broke under the weight of expansion. Rome needed professional soldiers. And professional soldiers required regular pay. The state introduced stipends, creating a standing army loyal not to farms or families, but to Rome itself. At first, the cost was manageable. But the army kept growing. Frontiers stretched across continents. Logistics grew more complex. Suddenly, Rome wasn't just paying soldiers. It was paying for roads, forts, ports, weapons factories, transport fleets, and engineers. War was no longer an occasional expense. It became a permanent line item in the Roman budget. To fund this growing military machine, Rome discovered something dangerous: conquest could pay for itself. Every new province brought taxes, tribute, slaves, and resources. Gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, silver from mines, and human labor from conquered peoples flowed into Rome. War began funding more war. Expansion wasn't just profitable, it became necessary. If Rome stopped conquering, revenue slowed. If revenue slowed, soldiers went unpaid. And unpaid soldiers were the greatest threat to Roman stability. Expansion was no longer a choice. It was an economic obligation. Yet even conquest fell short. Major conflicts, particularly the Punic Wars with Carthage, required staggering amounts of money. Rome began to borrow. The wealthy elite, especially the equites and senators, loaned funds to the state. These were not acts of patriotism. They were investments. In return, lenders earned interest, along with rights to collect taxes, monopolies, and entry into freshly conquered lands. War transformed into a business. The more lucrative it grew, the more Rome pursued it. Political influence drifted toward generals who could guarantee spoils. Senators turned into shareholders in violence. Private contractors, called publicani, managed tax collection, logistics, and supplies, pulling out enormous profits. Rome had built an ancient form of a military financial complex. So long as Rome continued to expand, the system held. But expansion has a ceiling. In time, Rome exhausted its easy victories. Wars turned defensive. Borders settled. Expenses remained high, while new revenue dwindled. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state resorted to an old tactic: debasing the currency. Under Emperor Nero, the silver in the denarius was subtly reduced. Later emperors kept it going. Coins appeared identical, but their value shrank. More money chased after the same goods. Inflation set in. Trust decayed. By the 3rd century, Roman currency was a faint shadow of its former self. The consequences were severe. The rich shielded themselves by holding land, slaves, and tangible assets. The poor had no such safety. They paid higher taxes, earned devalued wages, and endured forced labor and military drafts. Public services broke down. Corruption grew routine. The weight of endless war shifted downward, crushing ordinary people. Rome didn't just fall militarily. It fell monetarily. Now pause and look at today. Governments operate with massive deficits. Wars are financed through borrowing. Central banks create money to cover gaps. A financial class profits from defense contracts and crisis lending. Inflation erodes wages while asset owners grow wealthier. The tools have changed, but the pattern is unchanged. Rome reveals what happens when an economy relies on expansion, particularly violent expansion. Sooner or later, you hit a wall. There are no new lands to conquer, no fresh resources to seize, no new enemies to battle. The debt remains, expectations remain, but revenue vanishes. That's when the state turns inward. Taxes climb. Currency falters. Control tightens. Distractions multiply. We no longer call it tribute. We call it taxation, quantitative easing, or monetary policy. But the mechanics feel unnervingly familiar. Wars are still funded by debt. The United States spent more than $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, most of it borrowed. Someone collected interest. Someone secured contracts. And someone else paid the price through inflation, fewer services, and long-term instability. Once debt becomes normal, you don't need an emergency to justify it. You just need to stave off collapse. Exceptional measures become routine. Illusions hold until, suddenly, they don't. This is why the study of economic history is essential. These are not just tales from the past. They are alarms. Rome transferred its authority to private financiers, debased its coinage, and loaded its citizens with debts the structure could not sustain. Not out of malice, but because it was caught. The machinery had no way to stop. In our time, we inhabit a different kind of empire, digital and worldwide, driven by capital rather than armies. Yet money and influence still travel in tandem. War remains a lucrative enterprise. Inflation continues to target the vulnerable. And monetary mirages hold, until the moment they shatter. So what is within your power? You cannot fully remove yourself. But you can recognize the design. Most assume inflation is arbitrary, debt is liberation, and growth has no limit. The Stoics had a term for this: fantasy. True financial literacy goes beyond spreadsheets and portfolios. It is the study of influence, of motives, and of structures. It is questioning who benefits from your bewilderment. You were never meant to inquire how Rome funded its conflicts, or how contemporary nations follow suit. You were meant to watch the show, not examine the ledger. But now you understand. And once the design becomes clear, it cannot be forgotten. Empires do not collapse because invaders storm the walls. They collapse when the arithmetic fails and courage to correct it vanishes. If this narrative has shifted your view of history and the modern landscape, subscribe to Economic Story. The past already holds the solutions. We simply guide your gaze.